People will have their own personal biases and their own personal gnosis.
Sometimes it works, but a lot of the time it doesn't. More influenced or more exposed to Western ideas.
I think that's where people go wrong a lot.
To know what to study and to learn about. I slip away from myself and I go entirely by instinct.
You can do your own research, find your own answers.
Focus on all the amazing things that are ahead of you. More tools to use.
How much is this information worth and why do I want it?
It evolves in kind of a natural, strange way. Just let it grow how it grows.
Everything around you is your tool.
You have to expand your horizons. Do as thou wilt. Your practice is your practice.
Magic is magic.
When you change, that's okay and that's normal and part of human development.
My name is AIDEN.
My name is GEORGINA. And my name is Nike. Welcome to Occultism with a Side of Soul.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that I think has been discussed quite a bit, but has a lot of complexity and angles to it. We're going to be talking about mental illness, mental health, and occult practice. So this is a very broad issue that I think appears in all spiritual communities, not just like specifically to the ceremonial, witchy, or even broader kind of new age, alternative spirituality sphere. But mental illness has a lot of dimension to it, and we're going to be discussing it from like the angles of should mentally ill people be practitioners and what extent should they be into it, because that's a big question that comes up a lot, all the way to the ideas that some people have about mentally ill people being like special, or kind of like the relationship between if medication is a hindrance to spiritual growth, because I think we've all seen those discussions, and just kind of advice for mentally ill people in the spiritual sphere, and just that whole can of worms we're going to open. I feel like this is something we've touched on a little bit in other episodes and have kind of skimmed around. So let's just make this whole thing where we dive into it, discuss all the angles, and break it all down. Because I think this is a discussion that's very nuanced and a lot more complicated than, say, a 10-minute YouTube video discussing mental illness and witchcraft is.
I think to start off, we kind of have to talk about mental illness in general, and I think the conception that people have of mental illness both in and outside of the spiritual space, and we already kind of know about the general society way that people view mental illness. It's very stigmatized, but there's a different view of it I've found in occult and spiritual spaces, which is both more accepted and almost in a way fetishized, which can be very unfortunate. It definitely leads to people in certain cases not getting the help they need, because when it's made to be so special and cool and fetishized in its own way, it can be harmful more than helpful in a different kind of way than the general societal perception, because it becomes like total rejection, how dare you have this, it's not real, versus wow, you're amazing for having this, and both ends lead to not getting the help that people need.
For me, I mean, I'm very much in the occult space rather than kind of the witchy or the more like new age or broader spiritual space. And for me, I see either two lines of conversation coming up. Either kind of these, like, I say hardcore occultists, like people who practice extremely heavily, are doing like daily rituals very heavily, doing these really intense like spirit work type stuff, right? Like, I feel like in that space and in more like ceremonial spaces, you see a lot of this idea that mentally ill people shouldn't practice at all, and that mentally ill people should never be involved in the occult. It's too risky. And then when I go into more witchy spaces, I see it as like see it as a supernatural gift or signs that you're psychic or witchy or whatever. And it's like this really weird black and white dichotomy, because on either sides of that slash, like it's in either mental illness is 100% good or mental illness is 100% something that should stop you. And I feel like both ends of that spectrum, whether you're having the mentally ill people are inherently more gifted, or the mentally ill people should never be near any of this will destabilize a mentally ill person immediately, mentally ill people should not be in our communities, right? Like, these two things are both lacking so much nuance, because the thing with mental illness is mental illness looks extremely different depending on the type of mental illness you have. There's a big difference between someone who has, like, let's say ADHD, because I think ADHD is one that comes up a lot because there's a lot of controversy with ADHD medication, even in the normal medical world, right? With over-medication and a lot of these big conversations, right? Someone with very mild ADHD and someone who has schizophrenia that they've been hospitalized for numerous times, like that's a very different conversation. And I think when you say either all mentally ill people are blessed or all mentally ill people should be away from spirituality, like you ignore that there's a whole spectrum, right? Like every mental illness has different levels of severities and different levels of impact in your life. And so depending on what a specific person has in the exact case, like that makes what spiritual practices are best for them and what ones are going to derail them like extremely different conversations. And so I feel like when we paint mental illness with a broad stroke and just say mental illness, like that could be so many disorders. Like the DSM-5, if you've ever seen it, is a literal, like bigger than a brick, right? And so I just feel like that's one of the big problems with these conversations I've seen online is they're like people who are mentally ill. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like that's so vague and can mean so many things that I think we need to really be aware that not all mental illness is the same, not all mental illness has the same cause, and not all mental illness is going to impact your spiritual journey and possibilities in the same way.
Often like really misunderstood as, like you said, either something that you should be ashamed of, you should not be like, this should not be accepted, that is dangerous to society, or something that's like, wow, you're so special, you have this, that, or the other thing. I think that both of these aspects, like, I see them both in occult spaces actually, but more so I guess it would kind of fall under almost toxic positivity in a way, where it's like over acceptance of this illness and not wanting to get that illness treated, not wanting to get it looked at or helped out. Like there's a big stigma I see around taking medications, getting therapy, and things like that. I'm like, oh, you should just you'll be able to figure out on your own, kind of thing.
And the interesting side of that, too, is that it often is people that are not mentally ill or diagnosed with anything that they know of that are having these conversations versus people that are actually mentally ill themselves. And it's unfortunate because the people without the thing that would be affecting them are the ones writing the narrative about the people with the thing affecting them. Like, as someone who themselves is mentally ill, hi, that's me, whose brother is on the autism spectrum, more on the mild end, but he is still on it and has severe depression. My mother has a form of anxiety with some chronic symptoms that got passed along. My father has some issues as well. Like, my whole family has varying issues of different diagnoses, and all of us are still functioning adults. My mom is her own business owner. She went to school and got her PhD. Like, whether or not you have mental illness, it's often treated like if you have any form of mental illness, you can no longer function in society, and now you can't do anything, and you're seen as almost like infantilized. You're suddenly some pitiful thing that you can't do anything for yourself, so you shouldn't ever be able to do anything, and we can't let you. And it's not the case. It affects your life differently for everybody. And, Georgina's right. It's going to be very different if you have a form of depression that hospitalizes you versus one that is more manageable, or more mild. I have a friend who is pretty severely on the ADHD spectrum, and she definitely can't function on her own, but I can. And having other people write our narratives for us and tell us what we are or are not capable of, if they are not our doctors, is very harmful because you don't have any clue what we're capable of. For me, it's I get distracted, my memory isn't all that great, so I have to write myself a lot of reminders, and I don't have the best object permanence. Like, those are the more severe parts of my mild form, and they don't mean that I can't do witchcraft. It means I have to do more careful steps, and I have to plan more, and I have to remind myself, and I might slack on my deity work, or I might forget that I've just done a spell versus, consciously thinking about it. So there are certain parts that take more work, but I'm not suddenly incapable. I mean, I have my own whole platform that I manage on my own solo. I'm perfectly capable, and I have mental illness.
I think that notion that working with heavy occult concepts, like, let's say the Goetia or Enochian, because I feel like these two get brought up a lot, or like chaos magic, or these like very heavy involved practices. I feel like that risk is only present if you have very specific mental illnesses. I think if you have psychosis especially, that is where I think that conversation becomes a little relevant. Because when you're playing with the occult, you kind of deal with this liminal space of these experiences that you can't fully explain, that take a long time to process and journal through, that can feel like you're going crazy, right? Like when you have these very heavy spirit experiences, it can seem like it's otherworldly or something that's just very hard to process. And that's where you kind of do this little dance with madness and psychosis. And so I think for someone who has, I don't have this, I phrased that wrong. If someone has, say, schizophrenia and has had a lot of hallucinations in the past, and then they start doing these heavy, like, spiritual workings like the Goetia, and they can't tell their psychosis apart from their mysticism, I think that is where the real danger is. Let's say you have autism or ADHD, like, that's not going to be the same destabilizing factor. Like, sure, you'll have to work on your attention or something, but it's not like you're confusing hallucinations with mystic experiences. I think, like, this idea that mystic experiences lead to mental illness, I think, is only really true with mania and psychosis. I think that's where that's the really relevant conversation.
That's the biggest thing, is that it's about being able to manage it, not that, like, you can't do something. It's, like, how you manage it. Like, for me, I have various forms of mental illness that I don't feel comfortable sharing personally. And I'm able to manage them just fine now. Like, it takes work and it takes effort, but it doesn't mean that I can't do something. It doesn't mean that I can't stop being an occultist because of this. It means that I just need to work on managing those in my day-to-day life, and this applies to mundane life as well as the occult life. Like, I have memory issues as well, and I need to write things down to remember them. I need to work on my memory skills, and so I'll do things in my mundane life to remind myself about that, and I'll do things in my occult life to remind myself to do things like that. And it's just about management. It's not about being able to do something because you have a label put on you.
I agree, and it becomes a very hard line to walk, and it's why with any form of mental illness that you have, if you are in the occult or witchy or spiritual space, you need to be constantly checking in on yourself, and if at all possible, be seeing a therapist. And if you can't, like, you need to look up like the cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that are used, things that are healthy, psychologically approved coping mechanisms, whatever you have to do to make sure that you are firmly in reality and taking care of yourself. And I think a good reminder is that your mental health has to come first in order to practice. It doesn't have to be gone, and you don't have to quote-unquote get rid of your mental illness, but you need to make sure that you're in a mentally stable place. Part of ADHD for me also comes with, it's not quite depression, but it can be more like your emotions go from 0 to 100, and sometimes if something sets me off, it'll set me off for about 3 days, versus like my partner who does have depression and anxiety, for him it's more like 3 weeks. So if I'm having that bad set of 3 days or whatever it is, or if I'm overstimulated and can't really function properly, that's not the time to be doing magic. That's not the time to be doing any spiritual or occult workings. It's not the time to be calling on my deities in any form. Like, for me, it becomes, I need to understand my mental I need to redo that. I need to understand my mental illness in order to understand my practice, and how I, as a full person, all the parts of me, including my mental health, how I as a full person fit into my practice. So if I don't have that understanding, I'm going to be almost in like a manic state going about things, and I could be harming myself, I could be destroying my items. Like, I would mess up my own practice without those check-ins. So you really need to be self-aware.
Yeah, I think a good point to bring up is that when you're sick, like, I feel like if you're doing worse or you're going through a hard period of time, that there's certain practices that I think are just generally more appropriate. Certain spiritual practices are even used in mainstream therapy, such as meditation or kind of mindfulness, and more Eastern techniques are being used in mainstream therapy. And so there's certain practices that when you're doing poorly, or if you have a mental illness, are a good thing to continue when you're not doing as well. Whereas, let's say, the Goetia or kind of like Kabbalah or something that could be a lot more destabilizing is something you should just wait for, right? Like, none of this goes away. And if you feel yourself getting bad or having a rough period, just kind of pull back and focus more on the other side. And so I think this brings us into our next conversation, which is the complete opposite interpretation of mental illness. and it's the interpretation of mental illness as a gift or special thing, or the denial that mental illness exists and is rather some sort of spiritual gift, or that whole can of worms of that glamorized pedestal mental illness association some spiritualists have. I feel like this is more a new age type community thing. I see it in other communities, but I think like this pedestal mental illness as a gift thing is a kind of, I think it's a little dangerous, and does a bit more damage. Like, as horrible as it is, gatekeepers saying mentally ill practitioners are not valid and should not practice, like, that's awful. But I feel like it's a lot less dangerous than arguing that mental illness doesn't exist and is rather some sort of, like, gold star spiritual gift.
Saying somebody shouldn't be doing a spiritual practice is one thing, like, you know, that's not actively harming someone, it is just preventing someone from doing something, but saying that you don't have mental illness and instead it's this other special thing, or, you know, it's a gift and therefore you shouldn't get rid of your gift through medication and therapy, which is the one I hear a lot, that is way more dangerous, and that becomes where people leave their mental illnesses untreated, and if it is something that may cause harm to you, or may make your life infinitely more difficult, that is where the danger comes. And I see this, especially with ADHD, but also with autism, a lot. Like, this is a disclaimer. If you identify with any of these things, I do see a difference in, for example, psychic abilities versus mental illness. And understanding the difference between the two is very important. But if you are mistaking a mental illness for a psychic ability or a special title, that is also where another danger comes in, and the one that I see the most is crystal children. Now, crystal children, there's a lot of, like, signs that you are a crystal child, or that your child is a crystal child, or whatever, and some of them are like, you're intuitive, and you're an old soul, and you're sensitive, and you need alone time, and you're nonverbal, which sounds a lot like autism. Like, children on the autism spectrum, and I can say this from experience, from my brother, who I have spoken to about these topics before. Autism spectrum children are often seen as old souls because they are considered more mature because they are often less outwardly emotional when they are boys. Nonverbal is a very, very, very common autistic trait. Being super sensitive, either emotionally, so they might get hurt, they might be very introverted, so they need more alone time and being more sensitive. They feel often different from other people. Sometimes they don't even feel quite human. And so these concepts that are literally symptoms of a mental disorder, of I don't know if it's a disorder or disability, I'd have to look it up specifically. But these things that are symptoms of a mental disorder are being conflated with being a super special spiritual crystal child, and therefore that makes you different and special, and there's nothing wrong with you, so we shouldn't have to do anything for you to make you any better or get you help in any form. My brother getting diagnosed with autism helped him a lot. It gave him a lot of coping mechanisms. It helped him understand how his brain works and how he can work around some of the difficulties that he finds himself with because of the autism that comes, like, the symptoms that come with his autism do change how he has to live his life, and if he didn't get help for those things, his life would be a lot worse.
So the whole crystal child and the larger kind of indigo child starseed community is something that I think we need to really disclaim, that we're not saying everyone in this community is this way. I used to have a more negative opinion, but I actually spoke with a lovely practitioner, a Pythian priestess. She's very kind, and she kind of set me straight on a lot of things, and really, really great person. But so I've met a few people who identify with these labels who are not using it for spiritual bypassing and genuinely find connection in these identities. And I respect that. I'm talking about the people who use it as a spiritual bypass or way to get around the truth. Because obviously, like, we've spoken and we know many legitimate people with psychic abilities, legitimate people who feel connected to, like, these starseed indigo child labels. But we can't ignore that the shadow of those communities is that there are people who are using it to get around from diagnosing their children with various disorders. I think rather than children taking on these labels, it's more parents. I watched a Vice documentary on this, which I know Vice is really not like a credible source, but it went into this idea, like a lot of these people who are putting these labels on kids, not people, I'm not talking about people who find these labels on their own, but when they're putting them on young children, it's mostly parents. And I think a lot of it comes from parents having trouble accepting that their child has ADHD or autism or a learning disability of some sort. Because as a parent, I mean, I can only imagine that that's a hard thing to process, because, like, you know, it makes your life harder, and it's much prettier to say it's some sort of spiritual gift. And so I can see why parents do that and come to these rationales as a way to cope. And I'm honestly sympathetic towards it, because I mean, I don't have kids. I can only imagine, like, the struggle of being a parent of a kid with a severe disorder, you know what I mean? Like, that would make your life so much harder, and you'd really look for any answer, right? Like, you'd be desperate. And so I think these parents come to these labels that they put on their children out of a place of sadness and hurt. And so I think it's really cruel to kind of demonize the parents. I think they're really just people who are hurt, trying to find a way to process things better. I think it really is kind of using spirituality as a way to cope with the harsh realities of life. And I'm not gonna like jab at someone for that. Like, I really do feel bad for parents who deal with this. But I think that it's really damaging once they latch onto these labels, because it makes them, like, happier or more comfortable, and then not medicate their children or not put their children through conventional therapy and not get their children, like, a lot of kids who have learning disabilities need special exemptions at school and all sorts of things. And so I think it's really tricky and becomes, like, you know, I don't, people who pick these labels and whatnot because they're spiritually bypassing, which is a term of using spirituality to avoid real issues, like, I feel bad for people who do that, honestly, and I feel a lot of sympathy towards them. Like, I've seen people really bash people who do this and say that they're bad people, but they're really just people who are suffering and hurting. So once again, like, big separation between people who come to these labels because they genuinely feel that way and parents who are doing it to cope with reality. Like, I feel like that's a big difference. And when you talk about these labels and say that they are, like some people use the starseed label to avoid medicating their kids. I feel like a lot of the times people say all starseeds are bad or all psychic people are bad or whatever. And I think that's just a big blanket term and ignores, like, the whole range of things that go along with it.
Oh, yeah. All right. I think that this really comes from the way our society, like, looks at mental illness, because it only until very recently we haven't had good mental illness representation in any form at all. Like, it's always been seen as the stereotypical, like, your child's going to be, like, I'm trying to figure out how to word this, but, like, there's certain stereotypes that our society has created about mental illnesses that have really stigmatized and have really made mental illness a hard topic to talk about. And it has also caused parents, like Georgia mentioned, to try to find alternatives to this, try to find a way out of mental illness. And I think I kind of disagree with Georgia here, and I think that it is a really damaging thing that, like, you shouldn't bash the parents, obviously, but you should. These parents should have a talk with. There should be a talk with these kinds of parents that is taken on a critical level that really deconstructs why these labels can be damaging if you're attaching them to mental illness. Like, if you're saying that your child is a starseed, for example, where their soul comes from another place and they're here for a higher purpose, that not only that not only makes the child like have a ton of pressure on them, and it also sets up expectations for how they're going to act as well, because that's the other side of it too, is that once you have this new label and expectations attached to the child, when they are seriously suffering from a mental illness, then some parents might ignore the child's suffering, and that can cause so many different problems, and it becomes a real hindrance to that person, and it becomes extremely dangerous too, because the child could get into all sorts of different problems that will affect them later on down the line. And if they have this label attached to them, like once they get older, they might not grow out of that label, and it can cause severe hindrances in their adult life.
I think you guys sort of both have it, because it's a mixed bag. It is a mix of parents being irresponsible and not wanting to do what is right for their children, because, and it sort of stems from the same place, right? It's this societal shame that parents get a lot, where if your child has something that is wrong with them, if from physical disabilities to like if they're born with half a leg or something, or, you know, mental disabilities or mental illness, it's almost the stigma of if your child is born with something quote-unquote wrong with them, it's your fault and you messed up as a parent. And so both sides are doing things from that shame. One side is, well, I didn't do anything wrong, and they're just like refusing that narrative, but in a very aggressive, irresponsible way. And the other one is almost like a self-pitying thing, like, I would never do that to my child, I would never do anything to hurt them, so, you know, it's not my fault, there's nothing wrong with them because I know I didn't do anything wrong, they must be special instead. And so it's both hands of, like, the denying. For some people, it's even just denying that mental illness exists, and so when somebody tries to tell them that this is what their kid has, or the symptoms start presenting, they deny that it's symptoms of something, and instead, there must be some other explanation that isn't this thing that they don't believe in, even though it is very much real, but that's a whole other science denial problem. And the other part ends up being sort of the New Age community, because, you know, nobody likes to be the villain in their own story, so instead of being the person who is feeling at fault, instead they feel almost like a hero because they brought a crystal child or an indigo child or a starseed into this world. So it's sort of both. Like, it sort of goes along with that phrase of mental health and mental illness is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And the same thing goes for your children. If you have children and you've chosen to have children, their mental health is also a thing that you are responsible for. It is your responsibility to take care of them before they are of the age where they theoretically would be able to take care of themselves. So you have to make sure you're being responsible for that. And if you are not being responsible, it doesn't matter if you had good intentions or not. If you break someone's leg, you broke someone's leg, and you have to take responsibility for that. Just the same with anything else. So with mental health, if you're a parent, while you may not have the intention to harm them by denying the mental illness that they might have, changing the narrative harms them either way. So either way, it is still your fault for doing that. You're the one who is at fault for that. So while some shouldn't necessarily be bashed, they do need to be held accountable.
I have a good point, because I do see that parents who kind of jump to these tend to really avoid conventional medical treatment for their children, especially medication. I think medication and the occult community is a whole lovely can of worms. I actually recently tweeted about this, and I was surprised that most people agreed with me on being pro mental health medication. Of course, medication is not for everybody. Some people are not meant to take meds. Some people don't work with meds. That's fine. I'm not saying you need to take meds, and I do believe that over-medication is a bit of a problem, and there's a bit of a crisis with that. There's a lot of documentaries and stuff on that. But medication is something that a lot of people need to cope, and medication is a valid and legitimate thing to do and does not make you less spiritual. Because I see in the spiritual community taking of medication stigmatized and demonized more than I think it is in mainstream society. So medication by spiritual people is largely seen as a sign that someone is not fixing themselves with spirituality. Because I see this narrative in New Age spaces that through meditation, through yoga, through spiritual ways, you don't need medication, and that those methods of healing yourself, which work for some people completely and for some people only partially, are superior than taking meds, or people bragging about, I'm so spiritual, I don't take medication anymore. And I think just this idea that taking medication is some sort of spiritual character flaw, which is a part of why people go the kind of indigo child route, is something we should crack into.
On the topic of not needing medication anymore because of your spirituality, I think that for certain things you're definitely able to work through them easier through spirituality than other things. Like for me personally, I used to suffer severely with depression issues, but at this point it's like severely diminished, and I've only had to go to therapy for a few years for that, and I never had to go on medications. And I think that honestly spirituality helped me out with that, and that because I went to therapy around the same time that I started to get into spirituality, and I think the conjunction of both of them really helped out with that depression. I don't think it was one or the other, and I think that you should be taking both at the same time. That's my thing, is that you should take both in conjunction with each other, because they both complement each other. They're not opposites. They're not really a dichotomy. Like, there's practical medication, there's therapy, and there's spirituality, which you can use in conjunction to help each other. They're not separate.
From somebody who is in a family, like I said before, that has a lot of mental illness that runs in it, and has been able to both experience firsthand and witness, from the people that I'm living with, especially my brother, taking medication only helps in a lot of cases. Refusing to take it because you want to be more spiritual or more tuned in, or whatever it is you think that medication takes away from you. Let me put it this way. I can't do my practice if I am stuck in bed because my depression has hit so hard that I can't move. If I can't feed myself, if I can't bathe myself, how am I supposed to practice my practice? Like, how am I supposed to function in any way, not even just spiritually, but like a full physical thing? If I can't bathe myself, how am I expected to be spiritual? My brother, getting on medication, literally saved his life. I won't get into too much detail further than that, but without medication, he wouldn't be here. I know it's the same for a lot of spiritual practitioners that I know personally. Medication saves their life. Medication makes them able to be a spiritual person. It makes them able to function in every part of their life. So if you can go without medication, that's a goal for you, and your doctor agrees that it would be a healthy avenue because you would be able to get off of it in a way that would be safe for you, good, go for it, excellent. But there are also a lot of people out there who would love to be on medication but can't, and have to find ways to cope without, and their lives would be so much easier with medication. So denying yourself medication that would only help you is like saying, well, I have a headache, but I refuse to take Advil because I don't want to be less spiritual. It's exactly how you sound. Why would you want to avoid something that will help you, so that once your headache goes away, you can focus more on your spirituality versus focusing on your splitting headache?
Yeah, well, I mean, medically, all that mental health medications do is they rewire the chemicals in your brain to make them a more neutral level, so that you're at the level a normal person would be, right? Like, it's trying to level out your brain chemistry to normal levels. So if anything, I don't see why that would interfere with spiritual activity, because all it is fixing chemicals in your brain to function like a normal human. I think when people talk about spiritual experiences being reduced or cut off due to medication, I question that actually a lot, because what medication is doing, especially antipsychotics and anti-mania drugs, is it's preventing you from having psychotic episodes. If your spirituality is cut off by that, then is your spirituality just psychosis? Like, I know that's very harsh to say, but if your spiritual experiences and your connection to your deities, your spirit guides, your HDA, are abruptly cut off when you take a medication, especially an antipsychotic, honestly, that kind of makes me question your unverified personal gnosis, because if the only reason you're having these experiences is because your brain chemistry is off, then it's chemically induced and not an actual connection to the divine. I think this is probably the harshest thing I've ever said on this podcast. But every time I see posts like this, I really question it. Like, because if your brain chemistry being normal somehow doesn't, like, prevents you from having your psychic abilities, which, by the way, everyone has psychic abilities. It's just something you have to, develop, or you can no longer connect to gods that you believe are external to you. You know, that's very suspicious to me. I'm just putting that there.
But the one thing I do want to note before we shift away from medication, we can keep talking about it, but I just don't want to lose it in my head. The one thing I want to note is that there are people that do struggle with finding the right medication, because you don't always get it right on the first try, and to a lot of people that makes it feel like, well, what's the point? You know, I have to go through all this trial and error, and, you know, some of my meds make me feel worse, because sometimes they do, because medication is not a super precise science. Like, if you check off this list of boxes and we scan your brain, we know exactly which specific one to give you. Again, my brother had to go through, I believe, 2 or 3 different medication trials before he got on the right one, and some of them made him gain weight, some of them made him more lethargic, some of them made him a little bit more, I would say, spacey. He just wasn't quite all there as much. He was a little bit zombified. And so I understand the avoidance, because you hear these horror stories of, like, my medication turned me into a zombie, and that can be true for a lot of people. I don't want to, like, invalidate that and just say that medication is perfect in every way, because there's a lot of ways that it's not. But getting through that trial and error helps people get to the right medication that does exactly what they need it to, the proper dose, everything being on the track of where they need it to be, and that's why you work with your doctor who understands them. And I think that a lot of people avoid it because it sort of ends up in the other science denial, anti-vax kind of mentalities of people thinking that they know better than doctors. And you have to understand that it's a 50-50 process. You have to be honest about what's happening to your body and your brain while you're taking those medications, and you have to check in with the doctor who understands what kinds of medications might be right for you. So I'm begging you, if you want to get on medication and the first try doesn't work, please don't give up. It can be super helpful, but I also want you to know that it's normal. It's normal for medication to not work at first. It's normal to have to switch. So please don't feel discouraged if you are someone who has gotten onto medication and it's not quite right for you yet. Please talk with your doctor. Please try to find the right one, because it's not always as simple as, found this doctor, they gave me a pill, now I'm all better. Because it's not always that easy. It often is also paired with cognitive behavioral therapy techniques where you have to do actual work on yourself. It's not always just taking the pill and now you're good again, because other symptoms can't just be erased with a pill.
Something that's important to look into is the signs that you need to take a break, because you might not always immediately recognize them. I think the first obvious sign is if your spirituality is making you feel worse about yourself, then that's a sign that you need to take a break and look into your mental health. That was a big thing for me, where spirituality was making me feel worse, so taking a break is what I needed to do. The next biggest sign, I would say, is to if your spirituality is pushing out important things in your life, like if you're pushing away people, if you're pushing away things you used to do, if you're pushing away from anything in general, that's a sign that your spirituality is interfering with your regular health as well as your mental health. Because when you start pushing things away, it can lead to all sorts of different things. And I'm not going to try to diagnose anything, but there are various things that is a symptom of. Another big sign is if you feel that you aren't getting any better, but you're using spirituality to try to get better with your mental health, then that's a sign that you need to apply something else, and that's not the only thing that's going to be working for you.
I think it's also important to note that a sign you might need to take a break is if you've been doing a lot and not seeing many results, and you just are getting more and more and more frustrated. The frustration may also be a sign that you need to take a step back, and this can be for anything, really. Don't let yourself push super hard and just throw things to the wayside because of frustration, because that can also add to mental health issues, where you might start blaming yourself, especially if it's all pointed inward. If the frustration is if the frustration is at yourself and your own deeds, you may just need to take a step back. And not everybody's going to want to hear the taking a step back advice, just because you might encounter that feeling of missing out. Like, if I'm not doing everything right now, I can't stop because everyone else is so far ahead. But you have to understand that the only way to be able to quote-unquote catch up, to be able to learn properly and to be able to practice properly, is sometimes to take a break. I mean, I've had to do that with some of my hobbies before, and I came back so much stronger even just after 2 weeks of taking a break.
Yeah, I think a big thing that is important to remember is there is no shame in practicing less for a while and practicing more later on. Like, I think on social media, and by looking even at like old school like degree systems, right? Like, we see this linear progression in spirituality. Like, it's 100% up all the time, and there's never slip-ups. Every few months, you're doing a new practice, your dailies get bigger and bigger and bigger, and, you know, it's like this never-ending growth. I think that's extremely unrealistic, and I think that's something that a lot of us pretend is true, but isn't. I think in the spiritual world, like, everyone's always talking about how they're improving, how they're having more gnosis and whatever, but anyone who's been in this stuff for a while has noticed it's not linear. Like, there are periods of time when I make a ton of advancements in my practice, and periods when I'm stagnant. That's normal human development in every part of life. Like, progress is not a linear line in the occult, and so there are gonna be periods when you're not making as much success as you used to, or you're not accelerating at the same rate, or you're kind of stuck somewhere, or you even realize that you've been moving too fast and you need to take a few steps back. All of that happens. It's not a perfect trajectory up. Like, it's just not. Maybe there are some people listening to this who have had a perfect spiritual experience, never made mistakes, never tried a practice that didn't work for them, that they put a lot of work into and they realized wasn't right for them at all. Like, maybe that's you, but I'm gonna just say, and, like, it's not me. Like, I've made mistakes, I've done practices that I don't do now, and I've had to take periods where I practice, like, maybe just an LBRP a day for, like, 2 weeks. Like, it's kind of, I feel kind of dirty and embarrassing admitting this, which is ridiculous, because I think almost everyone listening to this will have the same experience. Like, I think we've all had periods that we aren't as proud of, or we're ashamed to admit, and that's normal and honestly kind of healthy. Like, this constant upward trajectory and growth mentality of spiritual development, I think, is really toxic. And if you're feeling stressed, or like a loved one died, like, the first thing should not be like scrying the aethers, right? Like, that should really not be your first priority. You should be taking care of yourself, checking in with yourself, dealing with trauma and grief, because in our lives, even if you don't have a diagnosed mental illness, like, there are gonna be things that throw you off. You're gonna be sad. You're gonna go through periods where you feel like shit. And the last thing you wanna do is, like, a ritual, you know, like, that happens, and that's okay. It's okay to be human, and it's okay to take breaks. And I think, like, we should all just be more open about the fact that our spirituality isn't perfect, right? Like, perfection is such a ridiculous ideal, and it's okay to take breaks. It's okay to come back to things. It's okay to only do your dailies. It's okay to not do your dailies. Like, okay, you're not gonna die because you don't do your daily meditation for a few days because you're dealing with trauma, right? Like, the meditation will be there. You'll get back into the gears. You'll figure it out. You're not gonna forget everything. You're not gonna suddenly be a failure. Like, no, it's gonna be here, and you can always come back to it. Just breathe and remember, your health matters a lot more than your spirituality. Like, if you're gonna do this complex spiritual work, your material life needs to be in a stable place. It's the foundation, and it's critical, and your health comes first.
So my final thoughts on the full issue are, just make sure you're taking care of yourself, and please be realistic. both in like what you think you can handle and also what is actually happening to you. Mundane before the magical in everything, every single thing, especially mental illness. Please just check in with yourself, and if you have a child that you think maybe something or the other, please also mundane before the magical. They are your responsibility. Mental health is not your fault, but it is your responsibility, and please just take care of yourself.
Mental health is probably one of the most overlooked things in modern times. We need to remember that not everything is going to have a spiritual answer to it. Not everything is going to have an answer to it that you need to try fixing with spirituality. It's sometimes you need to just take a step back, analyze the situation, and realize that you need an alternative source of help that doesn't come from spiritual practice.
My final thoughts are that if you're someone who's dealing with mental illness, I wish you the best. And if you're someone who thinks mental illness isn't real, or one of these kind of more anti-mental illness beliefs, to kind of broaden your perspective and think about that mental illness looks a lot of different ways and isn't all the same. I think in general, just journal a lot, do your shadow work, keep in touch with yourself, because even if you're the most stable person in the world, life's gonna get in the way, you're gonna have things go wrong, and there are gonna be points when you're not as happy as you are other times. And I think just no matter who you are, just check in with yourself, ground yourself, and take care of yourself. Mental health is a really complicated issue, and it's something that we all deal with as much as we hate dealing with it. And in the end, like, just take care of yourself, check in with yourself, and try to be a little kinder to the people around you, because a great way to improve your mental health is to be nice to people and not treat people like shit. Also, try to be a little less judgmental with who's getting into spirituality and their spiritual practice. And just don't, like, attack someone for being mentally ill, or assume what their mental illness looks like for them, or paint this broad stroke on mentally ill people, because mental illness can look many, 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 many different ways. And so, this has been Georgina.
I've been Aiden.
I'm Nike.
You have been listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt.